meeting now. Very small bit first about who we are and what the meeting's about. Just how the fire alarm goes off, I'm sure you'll know about it, just go out the meeting. About unlock democracy, for those who don't know, possibly, you can see a lot of places that do know who we are. Unlock democracy is the UK's leading campaign group for rights and freedoms and democratic renewal. That's what we're about there. We're the Greater Manchester Group. We've been active in this area for nearly 2 decades now. Since my name is Peter Davison and I'm the local coordinator. This meeting is organised in conjunction with the Hannah Mitchell Foundation, which is a campaign group established to further the concept of evolved governance for the North of England in general.
Excuse me, if you could speak a bit louder, I'm
Sorry,
hard hearing.
sorry, I'll try and speak a lot louder. Those are the two sponsors of this meeting today. Obviously, it's the aim of this meeting is to talk primarily about the impacts of the Scottish independence referendum for the rest of England. We're not here to discuss the yes and the no campaign going on in Scotland. That for us, that's a decision for the Scottish electorate to decide for themselves. What this meeting is about is what it means for the rest of England, and in particular the north of England. You're probably aware there's a lot of talk about evolved governance. So it's about what shape that evolved governance might take, and more importantly, who will be at the vanguard of any movement. Our speakers, I'll leave the chair to introduce our speakers. Just for your information, the meeting format is that the speakers will have the first half of the meeting, they'll all speak in turn. It will be Andrew first, Richard second, and Jenny third. And then the second half will be questions from the floor. Again, keep them relevant, i.e. don't ask about the Scottish independence referendum, because we all know what's going on there. And finally, couple of last things. Andrew has to leave by 8:45 to catch his last train home, so bear that in mind when you're questioning. And finally, I have to mention that there is a Hannah Mitchell Foundation meeting that might be relevant to what's being discussed here. It's actually part of the fringe meeting for the Labour Party conference, which is in town this year in Manchester again. It's on Sunday, the 21st, not Saturday, as Paul put in his circular. Saturday is not the 21st, Sunday the 21st, at 4 p.m.
Yes.
And the venue is...
Town Hall Tavern.
Yeah, Town Hall Tavern on Tip Street, is it somewhere like that?
No.
What's that? No, not Tip Street, I'm sorry, I'm completely wrong. Northern Democracy, yes please, Tib Lane, sorry. I knew Tib came somewhere. Northern Democracy, yes please, it's a Labour Party conference fringe meeting, starts at 4 p.m, the Town Hall Tavern, Tib Lane, Manchester. So if anybody wants to go for that, put in your diaries now. I now hand over to Andy Mycock, the Chair. Thank you very much, and thank you, all of you, for attending.
Well, thank you for organising.
Yes, indeed. Yes, thank you. Well done to
And don't mind me to take some photos. I'm going to take some photos.
The Town Hall Tavern is a splendid, splendid pub. If nothing else, if you go for the meeting, the pub's worth it by itself. Hello, my name's Dr. Andy Mycock. Some of you might know me from the last time I was kindly invited to come along. I'm a reader of politics at the University of Huddersfield, and I've been writing about issues around its Britishness, identity, and particularly some of the politics behind some of the constitutional debates we're having at the moment over the last decade or so.
Could you give your name again?
Andy Mycock, M-Y-C-O-C-K. It's extremely distinctive. It's from Derbyshire. There's nothing wrong with Derbyshire. I come hot from Scotland. I returned last evening. I've been there over the weekend, and I can report one thing, which is that the debate is increasingly insular, inspiring. At times, it takes your breath away at the levels of people getting involved in politics. I went to Edinburgh on Saturday to observe the Orange Order March through the centre of Edinburgh, and then went on and saw some campaigning about the Yes and No campaign. Yesterday I was in Glasgow for the march complaining against BBC bias, and saw a different side of it. I've got to say at times, although the debate is raising some inspiring questions about the future of the United Kingdom or the potential break of the United Kingdom, the tone of the debate is becoming increasingly febrile and divisive. And at times I think that some of the political radars of the participants on both sides are getting a little bit dim to how this has been read outside of Scotland. And I think that some of the comments, particularly from the Yes side, I found that the idea that England is some kind of UKIP-laden haven that is rejoicing in the privatisation of the NHS is a little bit skewed and doesn't read particularly well in England. It is fascinating though, because on Friday...
Question, please.
Yes.
Have there been any communication from Scots living in England in connection with the Yes campaign? I mean, is there
Yes,
any
there is a Scots, there's an English Scots for Independence, and there is also a Better Together in England as well, so both are. But they're largely... I think one of the interesting things about the independence debate in Scotland is that it is incredibly insular. It's not looking really at the rest of the United Kingdom, it's not really considering that, because it is about Scotland.
It's not insular.
Sorry?
Is that insular?
Well, I think it is in as much as it does affect the rest of the United Kingdom. I think that it
Because we've ignored it. Because we've been deaf to it.
Shall we get on to that point left and let me just do the intro before we have the debate on that? Thank you very much.
Yeah, you're going to have to control this bit.
Or put it in a way, let me get a whole sentence out before you jump down my throat. I think one of the things about it, which has been interesting, on Friday I was with Ed Cox from the IPPR North, who we were kindly invited over to Sheffield to listen to our beloved Deputy Prime Minister, Nick Clegg, who was talking around an IPPR North publication. It's called Decentralisation Decade. On the same day, John Cruddas published Labour's latest policy review, which looked at issues around federalism and devolution in England. Very light touch, not much detail on that. Today, I'm sure all of you were excited to know that Philip Blond has been in town, and Respublica have published a new survey looking at Devo-Mank. Devo-Mank, very good. It must have taken a long time to come up with that. The basic point of it is that debates about federalism across the whole of the United Kingdom have caught fire. The fact that you're here on a Monday night wanting to talk about this is indicative of the extent to which the future of England, the future of Northern England, has become a serious and significant political conversation. And in many ways, it's fascinating to bring the people we have together on the panel today to consider those issues, because they have in their own ways been talking about these issues for a long time, as have many other organisations. And it is only now, as the union appears to be becoming fundamentally threatened, that our politicians in Westminster have begun to start to listen and be concerned, not only just about Scotland, but also about government relations in the rest of the United Kingdom. And I want to introduce the three of them and then ask them to each speak for about 10 to 15 minutes on their particular issue. On my right is Dr. Andrew Blick from King's College in London, who is, and I can say this without any fear of a challenge, is an internationally renowned expert on issues around federalism. He's been drawn on for his expertise and published widely by parliamentary committees both in this country and outside and internationally. And it is a delight to have him here today, because I think he'll bring that kind of intellectual focus to the debate that we need. On my near left is Richard Carter, who is the leader, I suspect, if you want to define yourself as that, of the Yorkshire First Party, or Yorkshire First Movement, which really began earlier this year in its origins, and in a very short period of time has gained immense political traction in Yorkshire. In the European elections earlier this year, the party stood for the first time and polled over 19,000 votes. And since then, have found that there is an audience in Yorkshire wanting to talk about Yorkshire devolution and the idea that Yorkshire's interests should be placed before those in Westminster. Our far left, I'm not quite sure I can say that in political terms, but certainly in difference, is Jenny Crane from the Hannah Mitchell Foundation, and together with people like Ed Cox from the IPPR North, Jenny and Paul Salverson have been in many ways advocating the debate about regional devolution for a long time, for a decade or so. And in many ways, it's odd that it's taken so long, considering how well which you've advocated in this debate, for politicians to finally sit up and listen. And in many ways, I think that the tone and the way in which the debate has changed over the last few weeks and months is reward for that constant advocacy. And I think that Hannah Mitchell Foundation should be applauded for their determination, with, again, other groups such as our host tonight and Log Democracy. So, without further ado, I don't think I'm really that important. I don't think anyone else knows this now. I'm going to set off by allowing Andrew to first introduce the terms of the debate. So, Andrew first.
Thank you very much. Thanks everyone for coming along tonight. Now, normally I give a speech on this kind of subject.
Could you stand up? It's a lot easier to hear you if you speak above people's heads.
Does everyone want me to stand up? Can we
No, just talk.
vote on that?
Sit down and just talk more loudly.
Yeah.
No, sit down. Shout.
Yeah, talk more loudly.
Sit on the table.
Do something.
Come on.
Normally, I give a much quieter speech than this.
This is democracy.
Yeah, this is democracy,
It's
isn't it?
very
It's
democratic,
terrible,
this
isn't it?
audience, isn't it? A bit too democratic.
Go on.
That normally ends with me saying, but what circumstances in which all of the things I've just talked about could come about are unclear. Now, events over the last few weeks have thrown that particular, I'm very pleased to say, events over the last few weeks have thrown that particular ending out the window. And I wouldn't exactly say I'm delighted by all the circumstances in which that's happened, but it certainly could represent progress on some of the issues I think that we're all going to be talking about, we're all interested in tonight. But I'll start with the things I normally talk about and then get on to why it's all changed. Circumstances we're all familiar with, or living through at the moment. So to begin with, devolution. As we know, devolution has been introduced to a number of parts of the UK, Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland, some would say Greater London is also devolved as well. It was introduced in the late 1990s by the Labour government then in power, subject to referendums, supporting it in all the territories involved. And in many ways, it's been a great success. You could argue one way in which it hasn't succeeded, in the sense that part of the idea was that it would neutralise independence movements in the Celtic areas. It hasn't quite worked out in Scotland. I remember reading a Liberal Democrats policy pamphlet. It had some very good stuff in it, actually, from I think 2007. Came out a few months before the election that month that the SNP became a minority government after in 2007. But it talked about how the introduction of devolution had effectively marginalised the SNP. So people believed that had happened, that it worked in that respect. In fact, the opposite's happened. It actually, as it turned out, gave a platform to the SNP that it wouldn't otherwise have had. But aside from that, devolution, judged on its own terms, has certainly been a success. And let's not just look at Scotland here, let's look at Northern Ireland. It's part of a peace process which has had its difficulties. Devolution has been suspended for long periods, but I think it's certainly got something to commend it. And in Wales, it's very interesting what's happened there, because only squeaked through in the referendum in 1997, but now, and the powers on offer in 1997 were very limited. But now, not only has devolution been extended, and the Welsh Assembly's now got full legislative powers and maybe getting fiscal powers at some point in the not too distant future, but in the referendum held in 2011 to confirm the full legislative powers being granted to the Assembly, there was a large majority in favour, admittedly on a very low turnout. So devolution, where it's been introduced, has seemingly been pretty popular amongst the people, maybe more popular than the idea. The actual reality has actually been more popular than the idea when first proposed, and it can't realistically be reversed from Westminster and Whitehall. That's a very important fact, because obviously in our unwritten constitution, in theory Parliament can do anything it wants, but there are practical limitations on what Parliament can do. And one of the things it would be very difficult for it to do, politically speaking, would be to seriously tamper with or end the devolution settlements if it didn't have support in the actual areas concerned. So it's important in that sense, and most important of all, it's given the people in the areas where devolution has been introduced more direct control over their own day-to-day lives than they previously had. And that's very important in the context of the UK being traditionally one of the most over-centralised states in the democratic world. So all those developments are very important, particularly to the people in the areas involved. Obviously, the big but there is the majority of the population who live in England haven't received any of these benefits and haven't got any devolution. Now, I don't want to go over the past too much, but I suspect everybody here knows the rough story that the Labour government elected in 1997 did have a plan of a sort for extending devolution over the whole of the UK, and the model they had was regional devolution to be introduced into the different government regions. Now, as I said, up to a point we got that in Greater London, but we didn't get it anywhere else. And the main reason it collapsed, or the point rather you can identify at which that agenda really collapsed, was 2004 North East referendum. Now, there are many reasons that can be identified for why that went wrong. The powers on offer were negligible in the North East referendum. The Labour government weren't really firmly behind it. John Prescott was pretty much an isolated figure, many would say, in actually campaigning for this. And to wait between 1997 and 2004 before even holding a referendum on this, you could argue was a strange thing to do, to wait till the government become unpopular. Referendums are always difficult for a government to win, and to do it then was arguably not sensible. But I think we also have to acknowledge that there perhaps is a problem with the regions that were being used, that there wasn't enough connection between the people in the areas concerned and the actual idea of the region. And given that North East was supposedly the region that had the most resonance, that was most likely to actually get a yes vote in a referendum, it suggests that the other regions were even less viable. So there's a problem. How do we, given that agenda didn't work, where do we go? How do we extend devolution to England? What are the other models that might be on offer? Well, one model we've got is an English Parliament. This gets floated. There's a campaign for an English... Have we got anyone here for the campaign for the English Parliament? No, well, that's incredible. I really am very disappointed. When they're up in Scotland campaigning for a yes vote, or who knows, but they're not. That is quite remarkable, isn't it? Because normally you hold an event like this. Are you for the campaign for the English Parliament by any chance, sir? No, you're not. Good. I just wanted to make sure that before Good evening. So that is remarkable that there's nobody here from the campaign for the English Parliament, because normally you hold an event like this, and you'll get someone, and they're like, good for them, because the people who actually stick with these things, the people who in the end get what they want. They don't give up. But there's a kind of a vociferous, very small group of people who really believe in an English Parliament. Actually, what I think a lot of them are is a kind of English nationalist movement, but let's not go too far into that right now. But in theory, what they want could lead to a kind of a federal UK, that England would have its parliament, Scotland would have a parliament, Wales would have an assembly, maybe one day they'll be trusted with a parliament, Northern Ireland would have an assembly, maybe, but at the moment only Scotland are allowed a parliament, nobody else is allowed a parliament, England doesn't have a parliament, but in this federal, in some ways this is a satisfactory federal model, and you're giving England an expression, an institutional expression that it doesn't currently possess. And there are some advantages that people do understand the concept of England in a way that they maybe didn't understand the southwest region. That, they maybe weren't attached to these kind of regions. So that's one model. The problems with it are you've got an extremely destabilising situation if you've got a parliament representing 50 million people in a country of, these are rough figures, 60 million people. How can that really work as a federal model? It's going to be completely dominated by England. If it's not completely dominated by England, it will mean that people in England feel that they're being outvoted by tiny groups of people elsewhere. There are real problems with this model, and there's international evidence to back up that when you've got this large a unit, a federation can quite quickly fall apart. So there's problems with that. Another model which is, actually I should add there that also you've got no kind of meaningful devolution either. You haven't really got a downward transfer of powers because you're just transferring from a parliament responsible for 60 million to a parliament responsible for 50 million. So that doesn't really help you. Another model related to that is English votes for English laws, which is actually gets floated, and it addresses the well-known West Lothian question. Actually, I think as Alex Salmond has come up with the only real answer to the West Lothian question, but that's another matter. But it deals with the issue of Scottish MPs being able to vote on issues which don't affect them, etc., etc. But again, the idea of it having MPs, some MPs being able to vote on some laws and not on other laws, creates all kinds of problems when you come to government formation. If you've got a majority for one party over the whole UK, but not in England. So we can move on quickly from that particular model. Another model which gets put forward a lot, which I think is looking more viable at the moment, is the idea of extending power to local government. That these units of government already exist. That therefore we're not creating a whole new
Well,
tier of government.
they're sort of embryonic in some way.
Sort of.
They're embryonic.
Yeah, well, but there are. I'm talking about here about existing local government units. So the counties, the unitaries, the city council, whatever. If you can actually give them more power than they currently possess, which is a real problem in England, is that local government actually doesn't have very much power. It doesn't have much control over its own money. Doesn't have much control over its own policies. It doesn't really have control over its own boundaries and its own organisation. And I think that's a model that merits further exploration, and I think that's likely to happen over the coming months and years as we come up with a response to either Scotland leaving the Union or Scotland staying within the Union and becoming even more devolved. There's got to be an answer to what happens in England. The pamphlet I've written here, available online, Devolution in England, the new approach, which I wrote for Federal Trust and Unlock Democracy, I put forward a model in which you can have a system of, it's a kind of a sketch for discussion rather than the final blueprint, but I put forward a model in which different tiers of local government are allowed to select powers from a menu of different authorities and actually call them down from the centre to be exercised at local level. I think that the merit I see in this kind of approach is that you would be leaving it to the localities to decide for themselves what powers they wanted. It wouldn't be dependent on the centre, but equally you wouldn't be forcing powers onto areas that weren't yet ready to take them up. I think if at all possible, we should avoid referendums being involved in this at all. I think a local authority, if it's been elected by the people locally, has got enough power to call down these authorities and exercise them, because after all it is in the end going to be accountable to voters. And an important principle of all this as well is that the units you're talking about devolving power to have actually got direct democratic accountability. We're seeing a tendency at the moment towards creating kind of super units, combinations of local authorities which maybe exercise functions between them, but then how do you get democratic responsibility for that? Who do you vote for or not vote for as a consequence of a unit which you're not actually electing, doing something you do or don't like? So there's a problem there, and I think using local government is certainly a way around that problem. So that's the way forward I see is a kind of variable devolution with local authorities being able to exercise powers and choose the powers they want to call down. I suspect at first not all local authorities would take it up. Some of the bigger ones might pick particular policies. If they made a success of it, then they would probably call down more powers and other local authorities would follow them. That's the model I support. One debate I've had recently with various people interested in local government is whether calling down fiscal powers should be on offer in the first instance. In the pamphlet, following discussions with various groups, we didn't include fiscal powers immediately being on offer. I'd very much like to think that fiscal powers would end up on the list pretty quickly. Maybe a way of getting this through Whitehall and getting this through the parties is to make it look relatively modest at first, as has happened with devolution, and then if it was successful, things would follow from that. Who knows? But eventually I'd see the end goal as local authorities being able to control their own money and their own policies, and this is the way to get there without necessarily going for a big bang, disperse all the power immediately approach, which is going to be unpalatable in some quarters. So I'll wrap up by saying that that's the way forward I think could work. I'm sure there are many other ways forward, and I'll now get on to the bit where I say, but when any of this is going to happen, no one knows, because I think now we have moved a lot closer to this to something happening involving England. This issue is clearly not going to go away. Scotland votes to leave the Union. Well, who knows where that will lead, but we should have some kind of reassessment of all our constitutional arrangements. Then we'll have to do something. Obviously, when most of Ireland left the Union in the early 1920s, we managed to kind of pretend nothing had happened and carry on as though nothing had happened. But I think that would be harder this time. In many ways, if Scotland stay within the Union, it makes things more complicated because we have to explain why Scotland have had so many powers devolved to it, and more are being promised by the day. What happens to the rest of the UK? These questions have already been raised. So maybe the proposal I put forward is actually going to be too modest now, and if we're lucky, we might be able to get a bigger reappraisal, which involves some kind of constitutional convention, which maybe we'll get onto in discussion. A word on the constitutional convention that might happen before I finish. It's very important that real people take a leading role in it. There are models on offer, the Icelandic one, the Irish one going on at the moment, that incorporate members of the public, perhaps chosen by lots, perhaps elected somewhere or another. We also have to build in, and I don't think there's anywhere around this, elite cooperation as well, because if we get an assembly that comes up with all these wonderful ideas, but we haven't actually somehow managed to bind the politicians into it to make sure that they're actually committed to it, it won't happen. And I think if we look at Iceland, that's the exact problem that happened there. They came up with a constitution, it was approved by referendum, but the actual governing classes in Iceland didn't want to implement it, so it hasn't happened. So we will have to find a way, if we're going to have a constitutional convention, of actually binding together the public and the political leadership. Thank you.
Thank you.
That's a splendid introduction. Thank you very much, Andrew. That really set the scene well for us. Our second speaker is Richard Carter, as I say, from Yorkshire First. Richard has revealed, I think I'm allowed to say this, in the conversation where we started, that Yorkshire First will be standing candidates for both the local and parliamentary elections in 2015. So, in many ways, it's a political movement whose time might be coming. So, Richard.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me over here today. What I will try to do is I will talk about Yorkshire. Unfortunately, I'm well aware that we're out of the historic boundaries, but there are some bigger issues here, and the themes are the same whether you talk about this side of the Pennines, whether you talk about Cornwall, the southwest, etc. Doesn't really matter. I'll try to come onto some of the points that was raised by the previous speaker there. But for us, I think we're quite clear that we have a 1 in 300 year opportunity to create a Britain that works for every part and every region of the UK. And I think the time is now. You know, it was mentioned the UK, we've got the current issue with Scotland. Look back 100 years. You know, look what didn't happen 100 years ago. We lost Southern Ireland as a direct result of not giving more powers to that area. Move forward 100 years. You know, we're still not listening as a state and still not hearing what's going on. And now we're in a situation where Scotland can leave. Now for us, I personally hope Scotland stays. If I was there, I think I would be voting for independence. Sounds bizarre, but I think it's about your place, where you are, etc. So I think that's where I am. However, you know, for me, the question they're deciding is, are we going to be a part of creating a new Britain? And that is fundamentally what we think the challenge is right now. How do you actually get there? I think that's the problem, and I will try to come on to that. But first of all, is the United Kingdom working for all parts and all regions? Well, just a couple of weeks ago, Inequality Briefing published the the 10 richest and the 10 poorest areas within the whole of Northern Europe.
Yeah.
The United Kingdom won. We had 9 out of 10 of the poorest
Yeah.
areas within the whole of Northern Europe. We also had top of the other list, the richest inner London. Now, for us, when you look at a map of the UK, it looks to us as though London is hoovering up the talent, the wealth, the vitality of the regions. And I think this comes from an over-centralisation that we've got in our country. And it's not just a political centralisation. It's cultural, it's economic. You know, it's so wide. But for us, you know, when we first set up Yorkshire First, people's eyes rolled. Oh, bloody hell, they want independence. No. Maybe in the grand scheme of things, I might have considered independence, but for us, it's the wrong answer to the wrong problems. For us, the world is more connected now. And for us, we've got to try to emphasise the voice of the localities and the voice of the regions to build a stronger United Kingdom. And so for us, we can either keep on burying our head in the sand, and we can keep adjusting and reacting very, very slowly to the changes that are going on. But some of these things are so fundamental that we have to say enough is enough, and the time for change is now. You know, the over-centralisation, you look at it in the political parties. I was a member of the Labour Party from age 15 until last Christmas, and you don't need to know my age. For me, that was the home that seemed to generally align with my thoughts on the world and how to approach the world. But actually, I've increasingly become very, very concerned that the centralisation has affected the Labour Party, it's affected all the major parties, and fundamentally they're not hearing people's concerns. Now, how you actually address that, again, is very, very difficult. But regionalism would do several things. It would allow a new local political culture. It would allow a new social and economic culture to develop locally. And that, for us, would be very, very powerful. You know, you imagine that rather than having all the newspapers based down in London, that maybe the Manchester Guardian came back up here, maybe focused a little bit more on the regions. But these are huge issues that, you know, we certainly can't resolve this evening. Now, for us, well, how can you actually get revolutionary change when we've got a system that as we currently have? But as we say, the first point for us is the current organisation, locally and nationally, is not working. And that, for us, is the starting point. And as we say, 9 out of 10, and 5 out of those 9 are actually in the north of the United Kingdom. For us, you know, again, how does you change this? We think it's reasonably straightforward, actually. We don't think this is complex. But what we do recognise, and what we do accept is complex, that our system has built inertia into everything.
Yes, absolutely.
It's built inertia into things, which means that our regions are fighting with our hands behind our backs. And that cannot continue. So how do you actually get there? Well, when you think of your council, I think, or I used to think, the council, they're the ones who deliver the services, and I elect them every now and again, and that's it. For me, what we have to do is separate the political council from the local authority, the deliverer of services. And for me, when you do that, things start to crystallise very, very clearly. We've currently got in Yorkshire 1,225 councillors. As we've already has been said, they've got no powers. So now, if they've got no powers, what is the point of them? Now, I've spoke to various councillors from all parties, and what surprises me is more than one of them said, I am essentially the head of complaints for my ward. That, to me, is not the role of a councillor. Now, what I would like to see is the regions being able to focus on their long-term challenges. And if regions could address their long-term challenges, that will get us better outputs. So how do you actually change that then? Well, you keep the current setup of local authorities. What you then do is you essentially eliminate the ineffective and not fit for purpose councillors. By doing that, that's quite a bold thing to do, and whether you could move there in one go, unsure. But you could keep the same constituencies for general elections, the same constituencies for local elections. You could actually elect maybe 3 from each constituency on some kind of PR basis, and those could actually form the Yorkshire Assembly or the Assembly of the North, whatever fundamentally is decided upon. So for us, we think that that would tackle several things. It would tackle the political inertia, because, you know, I used to think, again, Labour was in favour of devolution. Well, devolution is one of those words now that has lost every ounce of meaning, and I personally am trying not to use that word anymore. Everybody's in favour of it. It's, how can you not be in favour of devolution? The devil is always in the detail. Most of the suggestions that are coming out at this moment in time are very, very straightforward. The public don't want more politicians. We tend to agree with that. How do you actually address the long-term challenges? So where do we go from here? Well, we think there's a reasonably straightforward way of getting here, as we said, but it needs it needs the political will for this to happen, and we do not think the political will is there from the existing parties. Quite simply, it's not there. I'll give you one example. The Sheffield City region, I'm unsure if you understand how they work. I'm not going to go into the detail around how they work, but suffice to say, there are 9 local authorities that make up the Sheffield City region. The board that runs the Local Enterprise Partnership, not the City region, the Local Enterprise Partnership has a board of 19. It's got leaders of the 9 local authorities, and it's got 10 people from essentially business, big business. Now, it doesn't take a rocket scientist much to work out that, well, if you've got 19 and 10 of them are from one side and the public voice is actually already in a minority, that for us is not good. It is not right. It is not democratic. So for us, you know, some of these things need to happen very quickly. We think the focus for the next 2 to 3 years should very clearly be on one thing: fix the UK. Forget about Europe. You know, from our perspective, you know, that is the right way to go. We've got a problem here. We need a country that works and is fit for the next 300 years. And if we can focus time, effort and energy on that, we would love to see a referendum, but not on regional government, not on Europe. We would like to see a referendum saying, this is the broad outline of our new settlement for this country to create a Britain that works for all parts. Are you in favour of it or are you against it? Now, for us, that seems so obvious and simple and straightforward as a way to go that people will probably roll their eyes and say, hey lad, you can never achieve that. Well, we think that it's better to have tried and failed than never to have tried at all. But we also think that it is time for change. And we think that if you ignore what is being said by the people that are currently in positions of authority, usually the leaders of the local councils that have actually got a little bit of power in the current system. But for us, as we say, city regions, no thanks. Yorkshire for us is its towns, cities and countryside together. And we think that that is the same model for many other areas. We don't want another 8 or 9 mini Londons with the same problems replicated. You know, so for us, we think, as I say, the time for change is now, and we've got a once in 300-year opportunity to address these issues. And this kind of conversation that we're having here, well, it's not much of a conversation, but but from our point of view, you know, if we could capture that energy that's being seen up in Scotland, it could be a very, very powerful, positive thing for a Britain that works for us all. Anyway, on that note, thank you very much.
Yeah, I was tweeting away there, trying to get some of those thoughts out there, so we should see whether we get any response on that. Wonderful, thank you very much. Right, last but in no means least is Jenny Cronin, and I think that it is appropriate that, Hannah Mitchell comes into this conversation at this point. We've seen over the last 3 or 4 weeks such a change in the tone of debate. I think it'd be interesting to see, what kind of ideas you've got going forward.
Thank you. I'm going to be formal and stand up, not least because if I don't stand up, I can't see you and you can't see me. But also, I'm going to be formal because it's the best way that I find that I can be coherent about what I want to get across, so I hope you don't mind that. Some of the things I will say are things that people have raised already, but I hope that's okay because it implies that we do have some, we have some points to make in common. I go back, first of all, though, to 17 years ago, in 1997, when Scotland voted for devolution in a referendum. It's a lot, it feels to me quite a long time ago. Since then, although, as Andy has said, having been very recently in Scotland, that he's got a sense of what the atmosphere is like there at this moment, as in these few days, as they go up to the referendum. But my perspective on that as to how Scottish people seem to be feeling about where they're at and where they're going is slightly different. I think that when you think since 1997, Scottish people haven't been on the streets demonstrating that they don't want devolution. It seems to me that they've warmed to it. It's energised their perception of democracy and the limiting extent of devolution of powers that they've got to date. They're clearer about who they are and what they want. And their core values: good government, self-determination, emphasising a tradition of the public good, and they want civil society to flourish. That's the sort of vocabulary that they use, whether their perspective is devo-max or independence. As we know, even now Scotland has the most devolved powers in Britain, and they are 5 million people out of 63 million across Britain. If you subtract the populations of Wales, 3 million, Northern Ireland 1.8 million, and London 8 million, each of which has some degrees of devolution already, that leaves 45 million people in England's regions with no devolved powers on those scales. Over the recent weeks, and I do feel it's recent weeks rather than months and years, the view has gained ground that there is no turning back in the Scottish referendum, whether the result is yes or no. I think this episode brings into focus the evidence and growing perceptions that change is certainly attainable. I don't feel negative about it, I don't feel pessimistic, and I think, as others have said, I think we should grab the moment. It's time to weigh up what we want, particularly here in the north of England. Reflecting going on from something that I've said already, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland have done all the heavy lifting. They set the precedent. They've got devolution going. It doesn't shatter or disrupt daily life. It opens doors on greater confidence and clarity. And I don't know how we get hold of that kind of feeling in England, in the north of England, in the kind of our cities and in our towns and elsewhere, that this thing surely is doable. I think the regions of England have lessons to learn from their experiences, their processes and institutions, and I think it should not take us another 17 years to define and achieve the scope of devolution that we want. So what's going wrong in the regions of England and our relationship with Westminster and London in particular, which makes devolution of powers and resources to the regions of England the solution? Now, already Richard has mentioned some of the statistics that I'm going to mention, and I did put on chairs a little A5 sheet here because I'm going to mention some numbers, and perhaps if you have sight of it, it might make a bit more sense. In 2012, the coalition government abolished the whole regional tier concerned with economic development, including regional development agencies. Now, we probably have opinions about how successful that was, but at least there was something in the regions. Since then, inward investment projects secured in the northern regions have fallen by a third, while in London and the southeast they have increased by a similar proportion. While central government championed London as their so-called wealth generator, The regions of England and the nations of Northern Ireland and Wales have become home to 9 of the 10 poorest regions in Northern Europe. I'm reflecting what Richard has said already, but I think it's worth listing them. They are West Wales, Cornwall, Durham and Tees Valley, Lincolnshire, South Yorkshire, Shropshire and Staffordshire, Lancashire, Northern Ireland, Hainaut in Belgium, East Yorkshire and North Lincolnshire. And as Richard has also said, not surprisingly, Inner London is the richest of the 10 richest regions in Northern Europe. So it's an England thing. It's not just about the north, it's an England thing, where there is a disadvantage and insufficient attention being paid to the situations in which people are living in certain parts of England. In early 2014, the Centre for Cities reported that London had accounted for 80% of private sector job growth between 2010 and 2012. In the same period, there had been public sector job cuts in most cities in Britain, but our central government was increasing the number of state-funded jobs in London by 66,300. The north-south divide widened rapidly after 2010. As has been said already, international comparisons also show the UK, particularly England, is one of the most centralised countries or nations in the developed world, and voters here are recognising that London receives preferential treatment to the cost of everywhere else. And here are some opinions from people in this country. In a survey poll in March 2014 conducted for the organisation Devolve Deliver, 65% of the sample polled agreed that too much of England is run from London, as compared with 13% who agreed with the opposing statement. The statement, London receives preferential treatment over the rest of the UK, had a significant 70% agreement versus 16% for opposing the statement. And 50% agreed more economic power should be delivered at local and regional level to allow local areas to develop their own economies. And lastly, 40% are more likely to consider voting for a party which pledges to devolve more powers to local areas versus only 8% who thought the opposite, that they were less likely to vote. So in other words, it's not just people like us who come to a meeting on a Monday evening. There are views around the country which suggest that they are beginning to turn in this direction. I see these snapshots demonstrating disadvantage in the regions of England and people's responses to it are very important and ought to be built on. People want powers to be closer to where they live and the problems they face. As has also been said, a devolved single nation of England does not meet those needs, in my opinion. What happens is power and authority inevitably gets drawn towards London in that scenario, which is precisely what devolution needs to resist. England's population of 45 million, 53 if you count London, has diverse investment and development needs, and they need addressing with a more closely focused perspective regionally. To me, these are all signs and symptoms of unconstitutional and undemocratic sidelining. It's not just raw perceptions, but the data and evidence is piling up about the democratic deficit in England, particularly north of England. Yesterday's structures and institutions are dysfunctional. They don't work today and will certainly not work in the future. People's opinions on this are beginning to harden. We then have to face the question, what do we mean by regions and devolution? I don't know how many of you have been able to see outside in the hallway the historical and hypothetical examples of various regional boundaries illustrated on display boards. But if you haven't seen them already, I recommend, if you've got the time, to have a look before you leave the building. But let's start with local government as it is now. Some parts of England's local government have one tier, some 2 tiers, some 3. The rationale is opaque, lost to general view in the midst of historical meddling and muddling. There are many different titles and potentially replicative activities already being touched on. It's just I'm expressing it in a different way. And those titles are things like county, district, borough, parish, town councils, unitary authority, London and metropolitan boroughs. And oh yes, unitary authorities can be called metropolitan city, metropolitan town, or metropolitan district councils. So at those levels, local government is ripe for simplification, and not for the first time. And the nitty-gritty fact is, though, that real economies do not observe arbitrary administrative boundaries. For example, 50% of urban workers currently live and work in different local authorities. I don't know how much you experience using the trains at rush hour, but if you travel between Manchester and Leeds, or in the opposite direction as well, and Manchester and Liverpool, or Manchester and Sheffield, you know how many people are commuting between those cities, and indeed the towns in between. To me, this is evidence that democratically mandated collaborative strategic planning across a region should be the rule, to make economies grow, work life as productive as possible, and make home more than a dormitory. You may say that this has been tried before in 2004, and yes, we have mentioned this, when the referendum in North East England did not get the electorate's approval to bring in a devolved North East England Assembly. And as has been said, I would agree with anybody who said that voters spotted the weakness in the model, which was not even along the lines of Scotland's arrangements at the time. People saw it as an extra tier of government, more politicians, and a threat of local council taxes. By the way, I would like to mention the report that was published, well, the version that I've seen in 2007, which was research done by two people at Northumbria University, which is called Taking Forward Democratic Renewal in the English Regions, Some Lessons from the Post-Referendum North East. In there, it really does, there are lessons as to how badly handled all of that was. And so I take the view that the more one is familiar with what that research actually tells us, the more one is in a position to rebut the people who say, oh, the North East England Assembly, nobody wanted it now. Make sure you know, well, this is the view that I take for myself, I want to make sure that I know what people were actually saying in full, the reasons why they weren't voting, and how the presentation was wrong, and many other things as well. So I recommend you have a look at that, and you can see it. You can find it online. Okay. With the current political and civic structures and institutions, what examples are there to date of pragmatic strategies in the north of England which demonstrate collaboration across a region and prefigure some of the characteristics of devolved government? Here we are in Manchester, so I choose the Greater Manchester Combined Authority, which was first granted statutory status in 2011, and others have followed since. 10 councils, and also associate members, 4 other councils. And I think it's interesting to note where they are: Blackburn and Darwin, Blackpool, Cheshire East and Warrington. So spreading out further than the original 10. It also involves transport for Greater Manchester, the Greater Manchester Police Authority, Greater Manchester Waste Disposal Authority, and Greater Manchester Local Enterprise Partnership. Doing good work, no doubt, but it is on an assumed consensual basis, as determined by each authority. The electorate did not vote for the combined authority as constituted, nor does it have an identity which the people is yet relate to. What it does demonstrate is that collaboration can happen across different interests, mandates, and wide geographical areas, and that is worth recognising when working out devolved powers and constitutional legitimacy. The other example I would select is One North, a proposal for an interconnected north, which of course you will know of. It is proposals for transport infrastructure presented by 5 cities: Leeds, Liverpool, Manchester, Newcastle and Sheffield. Another example of collaborative, not adversarial approaches. Their ambition is for the North to be a dynamic counterweight and complement to London and the South East. It's about rail, both freight and for people. It It aims to solve the problem that today rail is slow, the connectivity, interconnectivity is weak, and of low service frequency. Currently, road transport dominates, the motorways dominate, but need improvement in, for instance, links to the A1 and ports in the northeast, and it fills other gaps. It is rail that needs most improvements, with a new Trans-Pennine route and a faster route to Newcastle. The city regional rail network of services need more capacity in rolling stock and electrification. Just think how much better it would be to achieve what people deserve if the region in which these 5 cities and others of local points had devolved decision-making and revenue-raising powers to put strategic plans in place for this proposal. So what I would say is we need a federal central government, regional government that does most of the strategic work that directly affects people's present and future, and small local councils which deal with very local current services and get their funds from regions, which is another point that has been made already. And essentially linked to this assertion is the need for a written constitution, in my opinion, because that is what formalises the long-term definition of how our country and its regions are governed and organised. It's intended to be wholly shared by its citizens. You can read the constitutions of 10 countries on Scotland's constitutionalcommission.org website, plus 5 contributions of ideas for what a Scottish constitution could look like. You can't read anything similar and as useful on a website generated in England. An example from this list is Ireland. And I think it's appropriate to mention Ireland here, seeing as we are actually closer geographically to Dublin, here in Manchester, than we are to London. Their constitution sets out their basic laws, describes how Ireland is governed, the main institutions of the state, and reflects the ideas, concepts and values at the heart of Irish society. Over the past 75 years, the constitution has been amended a number of times by the people to reflect historical and societal change. The process involves a convention on the constitution which makes recommendations to the Parliament on future amendments to be put to the people in referendums. Here in Britain, I find David Cameron's glib talk of British values simple. I'm wary of his fleeting references to democracy and justice, because I reject the notion that that's what we're getting. They are not defined. We have no written constitution which overtly states what they are or what we want them to be. Compare the Irish constitutional example with the attempts at referendums in England, city mayors, police crime commissioners, the recent by-election for West Midlands PCC, which had a 10.4% turnout. I believe that the scepticism of the electorate is just, because these referenda are not grounded in a constitutional framework, but are ad hoc electoral events dumped on the voters. A constitution as a living document which is updated in a changing world, but still holds to certain indivisible values, is what Britain needs. In pragmatic terms, it is the key to successful, sustained planning and development. A constitution has a long-term perspective. It is clear about institutions' roles and responsibilities, including in the regions. What happens otherwise is that successive governments unpick structures and institutions, and the policies and strategies of the previous administration, subverting and disregarding the continuity, maturation and adjustment processes needed, making us all short-termists. So, to finish, 2 things I think which will set Britain on the road to being genuinely fit for purpose in the 21st century, and they are a written constitution, defining political and civic structures and institutions which are fit for purpose, and maximum devolved governments to the regions of England and to the nations of Wales and Northern Ireland, and Scotland if they happen to vote no on the 18th of September. And that is my victory at the moment. Although I would say that as far as what defines the boundaries of a region, I'm still quite uncertain about, and I'm open to lots and lots of debates, not only today, but in the future. Thank you.
It's very interesting, a number of themes that came out there. I'm not going to talk to you about it. It's clear.
Before we go, open a window?
I think there's one behind you, so that one.
I don't think there's the outside
I'm going to get some glasses, and if anybody wants any water.
First person to say that because all the hot air. Winter Pride, yes, indeed.
Are you going to have a break?
No.
You're just going to go straight through the
We're going to go straight through. We're hardcore. If people need to have water, they can sit.
Yeah, could I have some water?
Of course you can. Andrew's got to get back to London at 8:45 train, so
To be honest.
Do you want
get
some
some water out. People can sort of carry on.
Hang on, give me. I don't know how much we can really have being clubs and all that, you know.
If you do need water, there's water at the front, okay? It looks like he's going to jump someone if he comes through. Oh, no, he was just really waiting for more refreshment. Okay. Right, okay. 1 second, sir, before we go. Make sure I can get some clear view. It's clear that all the issues around local, regional, sort of, and what the north means, I think, which is always is the prickly problem in that. But right, I'd like to throw open questions to the audience, please, sir. I'm going to go ladies first, although you were first up at the arm. I'm afraid you should always be civil. Yes. Yes.
First of all, totally agree with Jenny in the way that you can only express these ideas of devolution when you look at the constitution and you look at very broad areas of politics, and also, you know, the aims of what is a region, what isn't. I'm not very comfortable with Scots Nats, or I have to say the Yorkshire first. I'm not sure that's the way forward. But what I'd like to ask, and what worries me most about the Scottish nationalism, or any nationalism, is the fact that some people, they're either misguided or disingenuous, the Scots Nats, in the way they talk as if there is something inevitable about some kind of Swedish democracy, either in Yorkshire or in Scotland, because of devolution. There's lots of benefits, I think, to devolution, but I wonder what people think about the fact that what I don't think is that there's absolutely anything automatically progressive about it in terms of independence or any other. Because they will have their own issues, they will vote, their voting patterns will change. So there's nothing, I don't think, specifically progressive about Scottish people and politics and people that live there, any more as anything innately one England sort of UKIP view about Britain, because I'm in England and I don't think like that. So
the kind of point you're saying is to what extent...
Don't forget politics, sorry.
To what extent does the constitutional architecture change the values of politics of a particular environment?
And that politics remains important, because I think there's also a danger of kind of populism growing up in these movements about anti-politics. And politics is still really important about what we want for that country or that region or anything else. Yeah.
I'll stop Andrew first, because he's not spoken for a while. Just going to say that.
Nationalism can be a positive force. It's not necessarily a negative, regressive thing. So if we talk about English nationalism or Scottish nationalism, they can be a positive force. It's very much dependent upon the context in which it's advanced. Certainly, I think you're right. The SNP are very much trying to promote the idea that we will become a kind of top-tier Europe country, will become a Nordic-style democracy. There's no reason they can't get there in the medium to long term. I think it's possible. I think they would face challenges in the initial years. But I suppose to get onto the point about what's in the constitution, well, once you've got a bit more control over your own constitution, whether that's done through independence or through devolution, there are things around bills of rights that can be done. In Northern Ireland, there's been an attempt to introduce a Northern Ireland Bill of Rights that could include socio-economic rights within it. We haven't got anywhere with that because of the usual blockages in Northern Ireland and UK politics around that issue. So my personal favourite model for devolution would enable devolved areas to actually build on a floor that could be provided by the European Convention on Human Rights and is as incorporated by the Human Rights Act. But if the devolved areas wanted to, they could actually add to those rights socio-economic rights and could build up in that way. So I think there are options in there that, by that means, nationalism, if it is nationalism, could turn out to be a progressive force. But I think that would require a written constitution, so I do tend to agree with what's been said earlier about that.
Just say that on mention, because I think it's an interesting point. There's a difference between a region and a nation. Yorkshire is a region, Scotland is a nation. But what are the potential that Yorkshires could take on some of the more inclusory sort of, that's the sort of thing I think you're trying to say.
Become a nation.
Yeah. Yorkshire, there might be police going around saying you're drinking Lancashire tea, you're a bit expelled.
For us, identity politics is here. It is with us. The question is it theirs or is it ours? And at a very simple level, you can either say, we're not going to touch identity. If you do, you will get the kind of UKIP reactions. They then form it into what they think is the UK identity. For me, I'm a proud Yorkshireman first, I'm British second. I have never thought of myself as English. However, I am not saying that is how everybody is. Many people would say, no, I'm Yorkshire, I'm English, and I'm British. And there's nothing wrong with having multiple identities. I think, we're grown-ups. That is how the world is. I also think I'm a European in some way. So all these identity things, they are there. And for us, we think they are too important to leave to the right. In particular, the extreme right. So for us, we in some ways would define ourselves in a very, very different way. We think that we are positive, forward-looking, outward-looking, and as I said earlier, what we want is to build a Britain that works for us all. Now that is a very different message from the short-term, angry opposition to anybody who might be an appropriate scapegoat for that moment in time. We will never jump into the gutter and do that. We will be populist if it's appropriate.
You sort of take that on, because you're talking about constitutions, about Ireland's constitution saying they have many good qualities. Ireland's constitution also had a clause about being the capital of the Catholic Church, and also which was quite exclusive.
Yes.
Now, how do you protect against that kind of exclusion clause?
I haven't really thought of that. I mean, there certainly are elements in the Irish constitution which I wouldn't want in a constitution of my own. But that's different. That's different countries. It is. But yes, it's.
Is it a drill of deliberation? Is it some more Andrew was saying about you need to do you have this process of designing a constitution?
I think you have to, yes. But I wouldn't be starting. The reason for my extended hesitation was I wouldn't start from what you're starting from. I'd start from the positives. And I mean, there are so many examples. This is why you don't have to invent a constitution totally from scratch. You look at what other people are saying about themselves, what other countries are saying about themselves, and there wouldn't be an international human rights kind of charter if there was not a majority of correspondence in that charter with what we would want in our own. The other reason I was hesitating was I was actually thinking, as others were speaking, less of nationalism but of regionalism, because I don't feel quite the same as Richard does about a particular part of the country where I live or have lived. I mean, I come from here, I come from Manchester, but I have either lived, worked, studied in Birmingham, in London, in Bristol, back to the northwest, lived in Macclesfield, and then out of the work I've lived in the East Midlands as well. And I'm glad that I've lived in so many different places and worked in different places in England. And I think increasingly, generations younger than most of us in this room will do that increasingly. And they will become more familiar with different parts of the country and different countries. And I go back to my reference to commuting between local, which local authority you live in and which one you work in. That is increasingly the case. And I don't see that necessarily going away, even if we actually get ourselves with our economic development being better than it is at the moment. I still think that there will be that kind of movement. So I think people identify with where they are and with the people whom they associate with. And I don't see it as such a big problem.
That's the sound track you've got to say at the end of your particular...
Can I quickly comment on the inbuilt discrimination point? That the constitution we've got in the UK now is designed very much with discrimination of that kind in mind, and to keep out Louis XIV and then later Napoleon. And we've got you have to be in communion with the Church of England to sit on the throne of England. You can't, until very recently, you couldn't be married to a Catholic, let alone be a Catholic. And we've got 16 bishops from a particular denomination within a particular religion with guaranteed unelected places in the House of Lords. So,
it's hardly neutral.
Exactly.
It's hardly neutral indeed. Right, but I know there's lots of people already questioning, so I'm going to have to pick off some of the people that put your hands up. What I need to do, because I think there's about 15 people want to ask questions, I'm going to ask 3 people to ask questions, make it nice and brief, and then we'll come back to it. So, you sir, had your hand up first, you sir second, and you sir third. Okay?
Well, I'm a Liberal Democrat and always have been. Professor Curtis wrote his report about Scotland and single transfer.
Could you stand and face so we can all
Oh,
what you're saying?
it's Steve Broadhead.
We can't hear you.
Steve Broadhead from Manchester. I'm a Liberal Democrat and have been. Basically, Professor Curtis wrote a report and I've emailed it to quite a few people, so quite a few people know about it. It's about single transferable vote and proportional representation. And in Scotland, in local government, that's exactly what they get, and they're doing an awful lot better than we are in England.
That's more of a statement than a question. Yeah, they're actually trying to say.
Presumably, you're all in favour of single transferable vote.
Okay, we go. Yes, sir.
Well, this is my first time to a meeting here, and I'm very interested in how everything that's being said is all about how I in Manchester, I mean I'm from Cornwall actually, but how I in Manchester look outwards. And there's nobody here looking at how somebody in Korea or South Africa or Brazil or the European community or Gibraltar look at us. And I think we're moving to a situation where soon we will have a lesser United Kingdom Broadcasting Corporation world service. And I just don't think that has the same rate. I think we're all, as we dive in on what we want, rather than how we should respond to the world and how the world sees us. I think we're barking up the wrong tree, really trying to do all of this just for ourselves in a little bit of the country that we're in. So that's my opinion.
And yes,
The test be driving to your farm, so they you do it till it. So there we go. Basically, I think one thing that we're missing, some people have mentioned, is there's been a lot of technocratic speak about, different voting systems. When you talk to people about politics, it doesn't really get people fighting up in the same way that, say, Scottish identity and things like that. You know what I mean? People forget Scotland had its own like system. Yeah, it's got its own set of ideas and things like that. But one thing that does concern me is someone who actually grew up on the border between Lincolnshire and Yorkshire. Is this kind of, if we're not careful about regional identity, it can very easily degenerate into parochialism and the type of nationalism that many people in this room wouldn't subscribe to, I don't think. For example, in my local area, Grimsby, in the recent local elections, UKIP did very well. Now, if you look at the demographics and makeup of Grimsby, in fact, it benefits more from outward-looking institutions like the European community in terms of getting funded and things like that. So I think, and I think also, particularly with your large historic counties like Yorkshire and Lancashire, there has always been a very firm, consistent identity within Yorkshire. You only have to look at people like Geoffrey Boycott and Dickie Byrne to see how they do very well in terms of promoting, regional identities and stuff. So I just wanted to mention that really.
No, thank you much. Can I take sort of inferences off all three questions and then throw them to the panel? The first one being really, which is about questions of democracy. How do you introduce fair and representative democracy within these plans and these frameworks that are there? The second one, which is interesting, which is sort of into the third point as well, which is this more international dimension, about how does it look that in an increasingly globalised world we seem to be reducing into smaller and smaller units of government in some way, we seem to be fragmenting. And I think the underpinning of that is this idea of interdependence rather than independence. Where does that fit in? Yeah, and the first one which sort of links with that is this idea of brokeragism. I thought the thing that was interesting now, which I was going to sort of raise, is well, how do you engage with people outside of this room? Monday night you've got these people here. I can tell you one thing that it took me at the weekend was that if we'd had this old meeting in Scotland, the average age of in this room would have been lower than please don't take this wrong, by a good 40 years. You would be seeing a totally different demographic. How do you reach out? Is it a question of language? I'm afraid that we're all rather versed in this rather complex language of federalism and devolution. How does that translate down to people? So, first question first. I think to go to you, Richard, first on this idea of fairer votes.
Where do you start? Currently, we clearly don't have fair votes. But is this a discussion about first past the post and forms or how you vote? Fundamentally, you have to have a system that works, that somehow captures the essence of what the public are saying. And that means it has to be some form of proportional representation in some way. Which one? I have really no firm opinion. The EU elections were fought under the Dehoit, I think it's called, I can't even say it.
I specifically mentioned Professor Curtis, now Scotland's done a PR.
Yeah, well, I think that one is quite interesting because a certain portion of them are elected through traditional constituencies and then it's topped up with the Dehoit system. At least that's my understanding. So they have around about 50 top-up ones and 80 elected from straightforward constituencies. How it links, I think it's a great point. What we've seen with the devolved authorities is that people's connection to them, people's feeling of family, for want of a better word, feeling of home and this is their place. I think that is important from an identity point of view. But it's there, you're right, how do you actually link that? What I've been absolutely amazed by is how many people from across Europe, from other regionalist, nationalist organisations actually get in touch with you. That to me is quite interesting. Now we will align ourselves with the EFA, the European Free Alliance. Now that to me is one of the most interesting groups. What they're actually trying to do, there are some nationalist organisations in there, Plaid and the SNP, but there's also regionalist ones. But what they're essentially suggesting is that the principle of subsidiarity, push powers down to the lowest feasible level that works. That is all subsidiarity is. If it's not a feasible level, don't use it. And that comes back to, fair votes. Well, right now, 1,200 councillors in Yorkshire. We don't have fair votes because they've got no powers. So actually we've got no votes. So anything would be a start in that sense. So I hope I've touched on two of them there. I think you're right around the techno-speak. I think it's very, very difficult to not get into talking about technical issues here, but I think we have to have much more broad brush strokes here. How do you engage people as citizens, not just as consumers of service? You know, someone said to me earlier, you know, pulling together your general election manifesto. Well, essentially, we will not come out with a shopping list of policies that we're going to let you all down on. Not you, if you're over in our region. For us, that's not the right thing to do. Other parties are doing that. We want to focus on what are the long-term issues and challenges of our region. So we will focus on those. And I think this is the way to connect it back to sorry, go on.
Well, I think I was just listening to the radio this morning. They were saying that Glasgow has more in common with Liverpool than it does with the Shetlands, and the Shetlands has more in common with Cornwall than it does with any of it. So we structure it geographically by drawing lines, and we see how that ends up in the Middle East, right? Where it may be, we should be looking at the demands and the needs of local people. You know, I mean, you're saying in Yorkshire, you're saying, well, let's just forget about Leeds, right? And you're saying that Leeds is one of the driving hubs of what we can do in the north. So we're not getting our act together, and it's to do with how we choose to look at the demographics and structure the demographics. Now, having said that, Turkeys don't vote for Christmas. So it's a really, really difficult thing.
But change will always be fragmented, won't it? It will always be fragmented. It will always, change will never be completely organised or completely rational.
So the way we choose to structure it actually keeps the current system going, and the civil service is actually set up in constitutional law to keep it going the same, right? And everybody's sort of grips with it. So, Jane, do you want to go?
I've just been thinking about the question you raised earlier about how we're perceived abroad and in other countries and why, or we're kind of navel gazing, to put it crudely. But I think what we're perceived by other countries is with puzzlement. I think because we haven't got our act together, and what I see that we're talking about tonight, and will continue to talk about, is essential, because we haven't got our act together in the modern world. There are countries that are coming from way back as far as their own development is concerned, and moving extremely fast, and adopting institutions and developing their economies in ways that are just going to overtake us. But I mean, that's a side point. I think our democracy has long needed overhauling, and we're coming to it very late. And I think it's absolutely essential that we don't try to do that.
Andrew, how important is this sort of congruence of political identity and cultural identity that sort of underpins some of these questions?
Well, I think it's part of the reason why we haven't yet found a form of devolution that works for England below English level, which, as we discussed, isn't really a form of devolution at all. And I think there are areas, Yorkshire certainly, Cornwall, which have a strong sub-English identity. I don't use sub in a geography, so I just mean smaller than English. And if the trouble is finding units that cover the whole of England in that way, it's very difficult. In some instances, city regions work, but not in every instance. So it's very important, and that's why I tend to favour a federal option for the UK, because hopefully under a federal system you can find a way of channeling a UK identity alongside another identity, a smaller, if you want to call it smaller, but equally strong identity. I think that's how a federal system could work if we can get it right. Finding it is the challenging task that may be the task for convention of some kind.
Right. Okay, well, anyway, we've got 3 more questions. I shall bring other people in. Lady in those with...
Thank you. My name is Lisa, and I'm the chair of the Democracy, actually. And I think one of the most powerful things that's been said tonight is what Jenny said about our current democracy not working in terms of the poverty of the regions, those regions that you identified, Jenny, compared to London. And I think, in a way, it's quite nice to talk about we're carving and look like this and we'll have these democratic systems, but actually that whole thing that will drive any change is what works, what will actually produce a lively, enthusiastic, prosperous communities for us, where the people feel they have some kind of say in what happens locally with the subsidiarity. And I think the hollowing out of our politics, so that people see it all happening over there, outside of our reach. And you get really to the point about the anti-politics, they're all the same, European, Westminster. I think that is the real danger for us. And in the end, the whole thing falls apart, or you get riots or something because people feel they have no say over what happens and they don't like it. And you get the development of populist parties like UKIP, which again is a real danger. And so that whole thing about, I mean, I was at the same meeting that you were at, Andy, in Sheffield, when the IPPR, I did put a spare copy on the table there. The IPPR was talking about produce its, what would you call it, the decentralisation decade, when it produced a programme for how you might make incremental change based on units of local government coming together and forming, if you like, organically, some kind of structure that works for them and works for their communities, and building on that with powers that can be that are there, that they can call in as and when they need them, and where there are some safeguards when the people at the top say, yes, you're ready for this, or yes, you've got enough structure, you've got democratic structure, you've got the systems in place to enable this to be democratic and to work. Now a bit of me thinks that was all very trying to kind of buy off the politicians. But actually, if you think about our politicians and whilst they all talk about devolution, actual real efforts to put it in place and actually produce it, they haven't done it. And so what the IPPR was saying, we're trying to be totally pragmatic about things which might persuade them, the politicians, that this might actually work for their communities and their localities. And I'm not interested in Yorkshire, Lancashire, Cornwall, those things which were formed out of, how many hundreds of years ago were they formed? Well before the Industrial Revolution.
1138.
Well before the Industrial Revolution, well before this kind of structures that our country now actually exists within. And so I'm interested in what works, how communities can come together, put things together. We make sure that they have a democratic accountability structure. Yes, absolutely, including proportional representation, and including, if there is that vibrant democracy locally, we can then give attention to the international. We can act. If you've got a lively democracy, you can do almost anything. If you've got a hollowed out democracy, you can't. And so the thing about being pragmatic, coming together, finding things that work on the ground and pushing for them, I think that's the way forward.
Thank you. Take a question out there.
Can I?
I'm just going to take a question for that. We have to have some kind of order, right? It's just going to be a disco. So yes, sir. Yes.
I live in the bit of Yorkshire that they threw away in 1974. A district called Saddleworth, which is just 13 miles from this place. And I've just done an 8-year stint as a borough councillor in Metropolitan Borough of Oldham. I got kicked out last May for wanting a new school, and that's another story. The problem is, our democracy, as has been said already, it is truly failing. Our voting system, people have no confidence in it. Every time we have an election or a referendum, the actual turnout goes down.
Yeah.
And we're on disaster. Democracy cannot do that.
Yeah.
It has to have a good active participation by a large proportion of the total voters. In Australia, they force them to, they're a randy lot, aren't they? They force them to take part by fining them if they don't. And they do. I mean, the Australians have put a we can. All the other forms of democracy you've been talking about tonight are consensual or they're cooperative.
They have a voting system which forces them to have coalitions for parties to work together. We're polarised here. Every borough is almost a one-party state, which is a highly dangerous thing to happen. This is what happens in places like Rochdale and Rotherham and other places like that. They're out of touch with the people. Now, I think the Saxons had a great deal of common sense, and their structure for England is just about right. In actual fact, I understand that genealogy studies have shown that we've all got a high proportion of Viking genes in us in the north of England. Also, a good part of lowland Scotland as well, and it stretches over, of course, to the Isle of Man. I would say, for a viable unit, you've got to be able to be large enough economically to support the political structure that is in charge of it, or that it has to have to operate properly. So you don't just put another layer on top of what you've got. But what you've got is expensive. Oldham has 60 councillors, Manchester has 90. Each councillor in Manchester gets around about 15,000 a year. Those in Oldham and other places get between 7,000 and 9,000. It's not enough to live on. It's not enough to make it serious. Somebody who's got a full-time job can't do the job as a councillor properly in the present system. So the whole thing's failing. In the old days, when the gentry ran it, of course, they had the votes. It was the captains of industry who were councillors. So democracy didn't happen until fairly recent times. So I think we have to grasp the nettle. It is a glorious opportunity. Take the Scots constitution, Devo, Max, we won't know. We're the northern region, from Newcastle down to the Humber, sorry about Lincolnshire, and down to the Dee. We're bigger than Scotland in population. We have a larger economy. I live on the top of the Pennines. If I go to the M62 at 8 o'clock in the morning, just as the rail traffic, the motorway is packed. It's one of the busiest motorways in Europe, and they're packed both ways. It is one economic region, the West Riding and the South East.
I just hurried on to a question, sir, because I'm really...
The question is, you cannot do it piece by... It has to be a radical solution. The Scots are leading the way. Not that's particularly fond of the Scots. I think they're a miserable lot, but that's another matter.
They speak very fondly of you, sir. Right, I've got the question.
We've got an opportunity. We should grasp
I've got an intelligent question to ask.
At the back end, and then it's come round for the next round of questions. I've got other people's hands up on the way out.
Just to be clear though, I'd really rather not speak with my IPPR North hat on. I want to be a bit more personal about this issue. So don't tweet me or whatever, and I'll be very frank with you about what I think and what I think we should do. Because I think we've heard some really excellent analysis of the problem, and this is generally true, but in this room as well, the speakers and others have come up with a really excellent analysis. What I think we struggle is to come up with any proper solution that we can then rally around and actually do something about. And I think that's, this meeting getting more and more frustrated and demoralised with the meeting. So I just want to focus my comments on what the solutions might be. And to mention, first of all, my kind of arch pragmatic solution, which we've set out in the report that's been mentioned. I've got a few more copies of it here, our decentralisation decade. And I'll be absolutely blunt and say that I think Westminster parties have got a complete monopoly on power. I cannot see that being broken very easily or very quickly. And for that reason, I think if we're going to see devolution actually happen in England, we've got to be pragmatic. We've almost got to trick the Westminster parties into it, which is essentially what Scotland and Wales have done to an extent. And so what we've set out in that report is the way to trick them into doing it, and it's very, very pragmatic. So I wouldn't even necessarily say we 100% agree. I personally 100% agree with everything that's in there, but that's the way it's going to happen if we're going to make it happen incrementally. Having said that, listening to the mood of the room, being persuaded by what we're hearing in Scotland at the moment, I do wonder whether we are on the verge of a critical moment where we could actually be a lot more revolutionary and radical than we've set out in our report there. If that is the case, then I think there are 4 things that we've got to do, and I'm just testing the waters with these 4 things that I think we have to do. And I share these 4 things on the back of my experience over 5 years as chair of the Greater Manchester Coalition of the Jubilee 2000 campaign, which met here and did lots and lots of work here over, as I say, 5 years up to 2001. And the 4 things then, based on that experience, are, first of all, we have to form a coalition. We have to recognise that we're all coming from slightly different positions, we'll all have different stances on what we think devolution really is about, and the geography and all the rest of it, but we have to form a coalition, so that's the first thing I think we need to do. Secondly, as that coalition, we have to quickly and quietly agree a very simple, what I call offer and ask. What are we offering to the people of the geography that we're talking about? We have to agree that. And also, what is the ask that we want of national government if we're going to get it? So that's the second thing, a very, very simple offer and ask. And I've got lots of views as to what that should be, but you will all have those as well. We have to negotiate that, clarify that, and then live with that. Third thing is that we, and just to say, this coalition, it doesn't mean that you can stop doing Yorkshire first, Richard. It doesn't mean that Jenny stops doing Hannah Mitchell Foundation. You know, Oxfam carried on doing their things, Christian Aid carried on doing their things during the Jubilee 2000 campaign. But they just, for a defined period of time, put those to one side a little bit in order to focus on the thing, the simple offer and ask. And I think that's the kind of model we need. The third thing we need is leadership. And I would say that the members of that coalition need to form some kind of steering group in order to discuss and negotiate, plan, campaign and all the rest of it. So you need some kind of leadership in order to make that happen. And then the most important thing, and I say this to encourage you all, is there has to be discipline. And it sounds a terrible thing to say in what I assume is largely a progressive group of people. But the only way, ultimately, you actually then see the campaign through is through really, really rigorous discipline. And I say that as I'm beginning to break my own rule, which is, for example, at meetings, people cannot get up and speak for 10 minutes on their own subject, which and then carry on. You've got to have discipline in the meetings, but then you've got to have discipline in terms of the campaign as well. I'm up for that kind of process. Not with my own people, but I'm up for that kind of process if other people are up for that as well.
Thank you very much. If you don't mind, I'd like to come back to our panel, who have been sat here rather patiently and are really the principal guests. The 2 questions. Sorry, we can do that at the end if that's all right, so we keep concentrating on our guests if possible. The 2 principal questions here is one about speed of change, whether we're pragmatic or whether we need to go straight to what we're saying, straight to Devo Max, and more to the point then, are we on this point of a revolutionary moment, and if so, is there a need for some more coordinated response? And I'll start with James first, we're going to go around and come back this way.
Well, I see a linkage between what's been said of pragmatic things with what else just been said. I think because you're actually starting with a smallish group of people, presumably. Yeah, I don't see a great deal of difference. No, that's all I'm saying.
Okay, Richard?
Yeah, I think some great points. Coalition, I'll just try and answer very, very specifically. A coalition. Last Tuesday we had a meeting with the North East Party, Yorkshire First and Hannah Mitchell Foundation and several people that are highly likely going to be setting up something in this general area. Yeah? There are things happening. We're in talks with the people down in Cornwall. We will speak to whoever. We are not an inward insular. We need to be outward looking. And for us, the big danger here is the point that was made earlier. They will try to find an England-wide solution. And an England-wide solution ain't going to work. Now, for us, that means you have to start from the point that says the regions that demonstrated, want it, should be allowed a means of trying to achieve it. I completely accept you don't want to get into turf wars, who's in, who's out. Is Teesside, Middlesbrough really in Yorkshire? Because it's not in the Yorkshire and Humber region. You know, these, But for us, those are periphery issues. Those are issues that can be addressed in some kind of way. Saddleworth, I smile every time I drive over from Meltham, near Firth on the other side. You come down and you see the White Rose of Yorkshire. And I think that's great because it's a pride in place, history, past. But for us, we're about the future. You know, this is about creating a country that works for us all. We can sort out the details as far as we're concerned. That is possible. But I don't buy and will not buy that the right answer is to work with the existing institutions. They have got us into this position. We have had 40 years of failures with EU cash. We have had 40 years of failures of central government to invest. We've had 40 years of something not working. The last thing I want to do is to give what is not working more powers. That to me is just the wrong way to do it. I agree with the gentleman here. You've got to go for significant change. That is what is required if we want to address our challenges moving forward. So as far as we're concerned, the detail can be resolved. We are in discussion with as many regionalists as we can be. Leadership and discipline, I think you're right. I think that is tough. I do not want to be sat here today. I did not want to be the leader of any party.
I just want to be here.
Well, but the thing was, no one else was standing up. And sometimes you have to say, well, okay, I'll give it a go. And you know, we had an idea in the EU elections, and it shows you how complex a problem that we've got here. We were offered a free stamp. Marvellous. We get a free stamp, that's going to save us 2.25 million stamps. But then when you start looking at it, we got a quote, £40,000 to send a leaflet out to everybody in Yorkshire. You know, 40,000, that was to do the printing. And then you've got to, the point is, the system does not allow you to break in if you are not an existing party. We know that from the voting system, we know that from the rules around these. We were even told, and I've got it in writing, it was the funniest thing I found in the EU elections. In order for Yorkshire First to qualify for a party election broadcast, you have to stand in every region in England. Can you imagine Yorkshire First standing in Lancashire? I mean, it's just bizarre. Whereas the SNP only have to stand in one region. The old system is rotten to the core. It is not working on any level. Now, one final thing, I can't remember which point it was about how to connect to people. You are right, people are seeing politicians as up there. But no one has mentioned here that the one part of our existing system that needs fixing, and that is really the town and parishes. They're actually very, very close to our populations, our communities in the localities. Is there a way of updating some of those to provide better oversight of the delivery of our services? Maybe there are better ways and engaging people in a different way. And if you did it at that level, you would, thankfully, get rid of party politics. You would start getting people to look at the regions on, first of all, as someone said, does it work? Secondly, you know, what's its impact on the region's people, environment and economy? And for us, that's the right way forward. So I hope I answered most of those points there.
Right. Very briefly.
Yeah, I just wanted to add something. The way I'm understanding what Ed was saying about a coalition, I think in a way we've got a mini coalition in this room. And I'm assuming that you're talking about, you know, here we are, Unlock Democracy and Hannah Mitchell Foundation, and there are other groupings with slightly different perspectives, but they're agitating and concerned about different particular aspects of how our society and how our country is working, but coming at it from different perspectives. And I'm beginning to kind of register that the coalition that you're talking about is those different groupings coming together about the issues that we're talking about tonight, about democracy. So they are pre-existing groups, but rather than acting separately, actually coming together. And is that what you're implying?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
You see, we're better together. We have that one for free. Andrew.
One opening that people may be interested, may already be aware of, is that the House of Commons Political and Constitutional Reform Committee are currently holding an inquiry into the idea of a written constitution. I'd recommend looking at what's on their website, and in terms of, they've actually published 3 draft examples for discussion of what a written constitution for the UK might look like. And the idea behind that is actually to stimulate discussion. They're not saying these are the final versions. So I'd recommend, certainly in terms of if a coalition of some kind is put together on these issues, a response to that committee inquiry could be a good way forward, putting forward some kind of model that very much stress regional governance could be a useful step. So I'd like to bring that to your attention. Another point, there's been a general theme here about the fact that up in Scotland people are actually connecting, getting excited about this issue. Well, of course, the reason they're excited up there is because they're actually going to be taking part in a decision that means something. And that's absolutely critical to this. Now, I'm not proposing that you can give people a decision that important every week to keep them engaged, or even that we could go down the Swiss route of having people voting on a referendum every weekend. In fact, you get fatigue doing that as well. But there is something to be learned from that, in that there's something real. I'm not surprised that people don't turn out to vote in local government elections. In a way, I'm surprised the turnout as high as they are, because local government really doesn't have the powers it needs to actually alter the people's lives, to actually make them want to turn out. So, well, there could be a clue there around engagement. Actually, there are bigger social patterns as well related to non-participation in representative politics that can't be reversed overnight. But I think giving people a real decision is actually an important step forward, and we've seen a clue there with what's going on up in Scotland.
Right, I've got an enormous challenge, which is that you've got to go in about 8 minutes. I've got 9 questioners down to want to ask questions. I'm not sure whether I should choose the people on a proportional. No. You've been wanting to get in for some time, so you go first.
Okay, what I wanted to know...
Very briefly.
Yeah, no, it will be, believe me, yeah. What I wanted to know is how inevitable is devolution? Is it part of some sort of historic process? I mean, did it start in about 1880, this kind of energy, or before that? Is it something where there's a kind of, a sense of energy which won't go away, or could all this fade and then it'll come back again? If you look at it in a historic, as a process, where is it up to, and what, if it doesn't happen now, will it happen again? Is it something, what is the momentum caused by? Historically,
do you want to answer that?
I can do that one.
In other words, in a sense, how serious is it as well?
Well,
as a moment?
When negotiations opened in 1706 between the Scottish and English commissioners leading to the Union, the opening position of the Scottish commissioners was that they wanted a thing they called federal union, which would mean retaining the 2 parliaments, keeping what was then, in fact, then the Queen, so it's keeping the Queen, as the SNP are talking about now, and having essentially a single foreign policy, a single external policy, but keeping 2 different parliaments. So that idea was there at the very beginning. It was the alternative way forward. For reasons I've mentioned before, they wanted to unite against Louis XIV. That centralising model was adopted instead. So the idea has been there in there from the very beginning. Federalism then, as you suggested, crops up again in the 19th century. And it's an idea that doesn't go away. How well thought through it's ever been is the difficult question. Whether there's been actually a workable model put forward that people can unite around has been the tricky bit. But it's always been there, and you can find people like, for instance, Winston Churchill in 1912 publicly advocating what was effectively a federal UK with regions. So he understood that you can't have it's difficult to have a single English unit in it, and you have to have regions within England. So lots of people have advocated over the years. It's actually getting together the discipline movement we're hearing about that can actually unite around a viable option, which has been the problem.
Thank you. So you've been having a hand for quite some time, and Peter, very quickly.
Yes, I can't see, as much as I love a Northern England Parliament, and I'd love to see constitutional change, I cannot see Westminster and Whitehall, the greedy muddle that it is, ever pulling that off without things happening before then. My question really is, there are 2 things here,
and that is, one is power, and the other is democracy. I don't think you're going to get democracy until the power comes locally, because people are not going to vote on something that really isn't important, which has been the decline of local political. So I fervently agree with Andrew's thing about going for it on a piecemeal basis, built on the coalitions of the willing, that are almost there. I mean, you've got things like Greater Manchester that is really quite a model for...
It's highly democratic.
Indeed it is, but that doesn't mean to say it has to stay that way, and if it becomes quite powerful, then voices can be raised down saying, hang on a second, you're not elected.
Can I take that question and move on? It's a very good question. Please move back. Yes. Visual. Yes.
I was just wanting to there seems to be lots of common theme in the room about building up a coalition, discussing, getting ideas, the anti-politics thing about that people don't trust political elites and therefore we should have ideas coming from all sections of civic society. Do everyone in the room, and specifically the speakers, think the best way forward is a UK-wide constitutional convention? Because that model, independence of government and not populated by political elites, seems to work for Scotland. They face down the intransigence of a Tory government in Westminster who were implacably opposed to any form of devolved governance in Scotland, and over a period of 15 to 20 years they faced down that opposition, and they are where we are now.
Okay.
So I'm saying I think that's a model for a way forward for the whole of the UK.
Right, two quick questions then before I'm just spear one. First one is quite simply chicken or egg, power versus democracy, which should come first? I should have put that over. And the second one is it inevitable we need a UK constitution, or do we need an English constitutional convention? So.
UK Constitutional Convention, I'd favour that. I've often said in the past that finding the circumstances in which it could come about is difficult. We may be reaching those circumstances. I also think, as part of that, or alongside it, or whatever, there needs to be an English Constitutional Convention, because we need England to sort out exactly how we're going to fit within that. In a way, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland have all had their constitutional conventions, had their constitutional moments. We haven't had ours. We need to sort that out before we can move forward. And if I can just say one other thing before I have to go back to the evil metropolis of London. Well, I can assure you not everybody is benefiting from the supposed wealth, and there's an awful lot of poverty actually within London, some of the poorer Tower Hamlets, etc. But yeah, my final point is that the issue we heard about, do we need to worry about our position in the world before we sort out our internal democracy? Well, it's a good question, but I think part of the answer to that is our interests as a power in the world are not very well served by having a malfunctioning constitution. And if in 1918 they could introduce Representation of the People Act, extending the franchise not only to women but to a large population of men, during the First World War, they could sort that out then. I think we can probably sort this out now if we want to.
Look, we're going to carry on until I think 9 o'clock. Andrew is going to have to disappear. He's leaving on the bombshell. The streets of London aren't paved with gold. So we can only blame Rupert Murdoch for that fallacy.
Thank you, Andrew.
And then I'm going to pass on this very interesting question to both of our other colleagues on the panel, which is, do we need the power first or is it democracy?
Well, I'd actually like to start from this room. This is part of the reason I've been very hesitant to this session, because I'm more interested in hearing your opinions than ours again. And I think that having got together this evening, here we have here's a body of people who found themselves in the same room, sharing a lot of the same ideas, that it's how you start having the kind of coalition of ideas coming from different perspectives. And if you wanted to talk about the idea of a constitution, I think it's a good idea to take this forward this evening from those people who are in this room who are interested in discussing it further, regardless of which organisation you're actually most affiliated to and spend most of your spare time when you've got it being busy with.
So it's a question of how do we aggregate this energy and the ideas that people have got in the most efficient way.
We have our information. I seriously mean it. I mean, I'm being pragmatic. It was what I was meaning earlier from picking up what Vicky said and what Ed said. You take as a virtue the fact that we are congregated in this room together this evening as having the potential to go on further to another stage. It's just asking what do we actually want to talk about together as if that were a going idea, what would we be wanting to talk about the Constitution or something else?
No, it's no changes in that. Good. To come in on that.
I think it's a great question actually. I've not considered the one power first or democracy. I think you've got to address them both at once personally. I just do not buy into adapting what we have got unless it's considered in the right kind of way. And as I said, for us, split off the local authority from the political council. That to us would address some of the issues in Rotherham, Rochdale and many others. Sometimes too close. Sometimes you need a different kind of oversight, and we think that you can provide that oversight from above and from below more effectively. And we think that you can't have a journey to get a regional government. It won't work. That's our analysis, and that's why we are trying what we're trying. So I don't know whether that answers your point really. I think it has to be both of them together, and I think we have to take the opportunity. What form should that take? Well, for us, it's and I hate this word, a constitutional convention. We call it a conversation for Yorkshire. It applies exactly the same for any other regions. If you look at the failings in Scotland, it failed on a few counts. It didn't have the SNP and it didn't have the Tories. Every other party signed up to it. With regard to how that moves forward to down here, I think that you've got to have a constitutional convention that also addresses other issues. So yes, you've got to get as broad a scope as possible, but you've got to look at how you engage the people. And if you don't engage the people in the right way in a conversation, we will not get good solutions. It will be designed by the politicians. And we're seeing that right now. They're coming out with the great ideas. And for us, we either have to take control or we let them take control. And it's as simple as that.
I'm sorry, with respect, you are a politician.
Yeah.
You're talking like it.
Yeah, well, 6 months ago...
Anybody who takes action in anything like this becomes a politician.
Yeah, that's fair.
Well, I'm really taken by what Ed said. Well, everybody's had their say and the things that bother them, and you can't take the ideas of what's happening in Scotland out of that right now, particularly. But what Ed said about taking that forward, what you said, I can't really name, and actually having it at Peter's, having something really solid that you can take forward, starting off with something, because they've done a lot of work here. It's never going to be perfect, and it's a bit like the vote for. We had to vote on a referendum about changing the voting system. I mean, most people didn't want that particular system, but most people that want to vote for it were voting for it because it was the beginning of change. And if you learn anything historically about Britain, it does not happen magically. So, because you can have
I'm not sure about that at the moment, sorry.
What I'm saying, you can have radical change, but it has to be, I think, one way
It's the idea of building momentum, isn't it?
It has to be, it doesn't need to be non-radical, but we have to start somewhere.
I just want to bring a couple of people that haven't spoken in tonight because their arms are wearing out slightly, which is the young gentleman with the cap on indoors and the gentleman with the corner there.
Thank you, Chair. I'd just like to start by putting a question in the mind of the audience, and then I'll direct a question to the panel. There seems to be a bit of credence, people seem in the audience think there's a bit of credence in Andrew's suggestion of a piecemeal approach to devolution. If we haven't solved the West Lothian question, how would you solve it as a multi-layered approach where you want people being able to decide again in different regions and different things? and also voting on things for the National Parliament. And whilst we're on the topic of National Parliament, this is my question for the panel, what would be effectively the result for, say, 650 MPs and the House of Lords? What would be your answer to that? Because surely we wouldn't need 650 MPs.
You don't have 550.
Okay, the question is,
Simple question. Does the 800th anniversary of Magna Carta next year give us an opportunity,
Yes.
or does that, will celebration of that actually kibosh any change?
very good. So, simple questions there, which is how do you link local region to the nation? What are the sort of ideas about what you would do for England and then for the United Kingdom more widely? Do you actually reduce the size of Westminster in terms of MPs? Do you actually break down the service, etc.? And is Magna Carta an opportunity or a poisoned chalice? Would you do first, and then you have time to think?
Magna Carta, yeah, I didn't actually appreciate. I think actually that is a great way of actually saying, 800 years ago, that is a reason to actually focus on the here, the now. Because for me, we've got that opportunity to actually create something, but it needs acceptance. And I personally would love to see a new outline of a constitution agreed and put to a referendum, because it's actually a great way of overcoming quite a lot of issues all at once. But I think the piecemeal approach does not allow that voice and that discussion to be had. So for me, I think tying it in with next year it sounds a very, very sensible thing to do from the Constitutional Convention.
You've got 9 months.
Sorry?
You've got 9 months.
Yeah, well, I completely accept, but it might be that is part of the process, but it's a great way to focus minds.
I agree with that, and to have a constitution is a centralising process, whereas this paper is about decentralising. And we're always seeing, this is what I said earlier, we're always seeing organisations, not political, they swing between centralisation and decentralisation. And yet there are middle ways. Okay, so you have to balance this constitutional thing, right, which is going like that, with the decentralisation thing. And that's a difficult journey to tread, I think. But I think that it is possible to happen.
There are lessons to be learned. We look at Australia, we look at Germany, we look at the federal systems. The British can learn, obviously, from other examples.
With respect, didn't British constitutional lawyers write the German constitution?
Yes, they just didn't think it was fit for us. Lesson. So how do you think about this idea of linking region to nation? How do we actually, is there an English federal parliament, or do we go straight to the UK as well?
Well, certainly the Houses of Parliament need completely rearranging. I mean, I'm sure 650 is going to be too many in a federal parliament. The role is going to be different, and the relationship as well with the regions. How do you get the communication from the regions, let's say, to central government? You get rid of the House of Lords, and you have a Senate of the regions and nations, for instance. But in a way, I want to get to first base, first of all. Yes.
There's a bit of danger that if you don't know what you're reforming to, it makes it very difficult to know what you're road mapping from. Because one of the things that's been a criticism of the Better Together campaign is that it doesn't have a vision for the United Kingdom at the end of all this. It's all very bespoke. And in many ways, they're creating fires wherever they go. They go to Scotland, they give power away. They go to fire in Wales and Northern Ireland. In England, they give power to... There doesn't seem to be an end vision. At the end of this process, what is the United Kingdom's bilateral constitutional relationship?
Because the constitution will be... I don't necessarily see this kind of centralisation and the kind of dispersion and going on to the other. Surely a constitution is about every citizen, wherever they happen to be. It applies to you wherever you are, whichever village, town, city, region you're in.
A constitution can enshrine decentralisation.
Yes, exactly, because it actually talks about the structures, the institutions, where they're located, whether they are central institutions, regional, local, and actually how they're supposed to link together. I don't see why we can't, look at things that way.
I can just take a question from the gentleman behind, because you've already spoken. I just want to make sure everyone gets a voice. Yes, sir.
I was just thinking, surely the major problem, although there is a majority for reform for devolution, although you don't like the word, of some form, there is going to be quite massive disagreement about what's appropriate. And there's strong arguments for whatever rough sort of size and powers it is should be mirrored across England. Each specific locality will have a different idea of what that should be. For example, Yorkshire would like to be Yorkshire, here we're doing for Horsham North, Cornwall would like something much smaller. Birmingham might be in...
If you let the gentleman finish his question,
Cornwall is involved, I'd say.
Yeah, close involved.
And say Birmingham might prefer sort of city region sort of thing. You can, and like in the counties, they might just prefer more powers for their original county council. How do you get consensus on what that ask is from central government? And when it comes down to it, if the sort of devolution isn't the one specific locality and specific people would want, would they actually ultimately prefer to go back to the status quo?
You made me wonder whether we ought to actually, not here in this room, but one of the approaches is actually to identify what are the features, what are the factors which we should take into account when determining what a region should be qualitatively.
Will you ever get a majority in favour?
Sorry?
Will you ever get a majority in favour?
Well, there will be a more important, certain factors that will be weighted differently in different parts of the country. So if you take Cornwall, then, I mean, anywhere that's bounded by the sea practically all the way around, and they relate to the sea, will have different concerns from somewhere that's kind of landlocked. But it also depends on the kinds of industries that it depends on the economy, what works. It depends on what the shape of your geography is, so that what your communications ought to be. There are all sorts of things like that.
Richard, just quickly come in. There are two last voices. I think at 9 o'clock I've been told that the bells will chime.
Yeah, so if anybody wants to put down their names, by the way, we've got a list somewhere, so we'll make sure it...
We should do that in my
Richard?
I think some of this goes back to the heart of, or the essence of what Englishness is. I actually think that there are several different Englishes in England, and I think that you have to allow those to develop in their own way. I think you also, that the point that you made, essentially asymmetric devolution. Why does it have to be the whole of England? It doesn't have to. What it could be, what we've actually said, and I'm going to read you something out from part of the agreement that we are currently developing from the parties of the Anna Mitchell Foundation and a few others. This is not finalised, but the regions of the UK, however you define them, should consider how they should arrange their own affairs to help build thriving, successful regions that deliver with and for our people. Now, that is essentially, I think, the heart of the problem with England, that some parts of it think of themselves in a regional kind of manner and others don't. That is why we think it has to be some form of constitutional convention. I would prefer it to be the whole of England, but it would worry me because if it was imposed that, oh no, it's going to be the city-region approach, that for us, we think that is fundamentally flawed and wrong. We should replicate the successful systems, Welsh and Scots. We should not replicate, we should not give more powers to those that have demonstrated their failure. And for us, that is the local political councils. And that's because they don't have the...
successful systems of Germany.
Okay, let's say US
I'm Angela Rayner. I'm actually a prospective parliamentary candidate for actually on the line, the Labour candidate, so hopefully pretty certain that I'll be an MP next year. And I'm also the youth and regional...
See, that's what's wrong.
Yeah. Exactly, yeah. I would like more participation, actually, that's why I'm here. I'm also, I was a home helping local authority, and I'm also the regional convener for 200,000 public sector workers in the North West as well. So we've just published an economic plan for the North West. So I've been very interested, and I'd like to say that I'm listening tonight, certainly, as somebody who's going in there about how we can, the devolution of power. And I absolutely agree that our current economic strategy just doesn't work. It doesn't work, and it has to be changed. And some of the things that were said about what happened in the North East, one of the things that I think has happened there, what happened since then, is the economic crash. You know, and the whole system, and you know, and I think the climate we're in now has created change, and I think we can be bold about what we want, and it doesn't have to necessarily be more nationalistic views, because I really worry about that, to be honest. I really worry about that. But I think some of those issues around engagement, and I'd like to see more democratic local control. And I certainly from what I'm hearing in my party is around how we can make those differences. I don't think they're not listening. I disagree with that, and you know, I'd be very depressed if I'm going into Parliament to hear people. You know, I hear the vote for Britain. I loved your idea of the House of Lords. Fantastic. Let's change it so radically. But so yes, my point really was I've come here tonight to listen to what's being said, and I do think that we could have a bold strategy. I do think that you need to be more coherent as a group, because to be honest, it's a bit dysfunctional, and some of the things that some people have said have been woke, and other things I thought absolutely, and I think you're going to have to rationalise that in order to get that change that you want to happen. But I wouldn't say that certainly people that are in politics at the moment don't want that, because I know that my members, who I currently represent, the 200,000 in the North West, don't want the plan that we've got currently. And I certainly, as a member of Parliament, and the constituents that I've spoken to, haven't said to me that that's what they want. So I'm hoping that people are listening to that, because if we don't, the threat from UKIP and others is a real threat to our political system, and the apathy that we've seen in the political process. I want a massive majority. I want people to vote for me because they believe in make that change, not the other way around.
I voted for you when you were sitting with them, by the way, so there you go. Final words, sir.
I think whatever happens with the vote on Thursday, that this is a fantastic success story, what's happened in Scotland, because they are deciding their own future. And actually, I think we are living through a period of enormous constitutional change, and have been for about 20 years. I think the pace, if anything, is accelerated. But I do think people have got the confidence to adapt, however much they might not like particular aspects of whatever systems are around. They do seem pretty adaptable in terms of being able to accommodate changes that take place. I don't think there's any shortage of politics in this country. I think just a lot of it doesn't involve elected councillors or other parts of what's seen as a political establishment, because people have made all sorts of things happen in Manchester and the rest of the North of England over the last 20 years. So I think we ought to be very pleased with what's happening now, and it should encourage us to redouble our efforts after.
I think you're absolutely right. Regardless of the vote on Friday morning, whatever comes out, it shouldn't have got to that situation, but the Scottish independence referendum has energised what other people were already doing, and the fact that we turned up here tonight and had such a lively debate has been true. There are clearly big questions about this local, regional, northern identity. How do you fit this in? What kind of conversation does England have in some senses? And also questions about identity, which I think have come to the fore here as well. I think it's been fascinating to hear, how democracy and power is debated, and it is an important question. Is it the chicken or the egg? How is this achieved? But I think that both the Democracy and Hannah Mitchell Foundation should be congratulated for being ahead of the curve, and the fact that you've been advocating for change for such a long time. I think also the IPPR North should be congratulated as well. But you do get the sense that there's a point of time, there's a change in the fact that our politicians are starting, just starting to listen, suggests that as we go forward to the election next year, but also to June 2015, you're right, we've got 9 months until Magna Carta, that there is a need for leadership, for discipline, for bringing ideas together and presenting something to government that they have to answer to. I think it's a clear point there that they need to answer that, and I think that you all...
There's never been a better time.
There never has been a better time.
30 or 40 years.
And I think that you should be congratulated for giving up your time on a Monday night to come and, you know, argue so passionately about it.
Go and spread the word.
Go and spread the word. I think that's it. And I just think that more than anything, we thank our three speakers. They sort of Roy Hattersley styles, and there's an empty glass rather than a sort of laugh. But our three speakers for giving up their time this evening and being so open and so dynamic in those questions and their presentations. So thank you very much.